So today on our program, we're talking with Matt Cox. He has written an article for Actify Press called Black Panther versus Batman, Social Influence on Comic Book Heroes. So Matt, welcome to the program.
Good to be here.
It's great to have you. So why don't we just jump on in? So in your article, you actually bring up a really good point that T'Challa has access to magic naturally. And Batman can only use magic relics that any other human can use. Why do you think this is significant?
Well, this was brought up in the Quora article as one of the reasons that Batman is superior, because Batman doesn't have any intrinsic powers. Without his bat stuff, he's just a really good fighter and a really smart guy. T'Challa, very similar, except he is blessed by the Panther totem that gives him certain degree of powers. I think it just sort of amplifies his strength. Again, I didn't grow up reading it, so I'm going to have to catch up on 50 years of history. But in the comic book universes, magic isn't... Let me start over with that. Even in Harry Potter, magic requires study. That's why they send the kids to school. I mean, granted, you can generally do things by just flicking a wand and saying a word, but to get better at things, you have to, practice, you have to study, you have to experiment, etc. So Arthur C. Clarke once said, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And one of the lines I was proud of in there is that I flipped it and said, any magic is indistinguishable from technology in the comic book worlds, because they have to treat it like a science. They have to study it. They have to utilize it. I mean, you don't have to have a degree in chemistry and metallurgy to use a gun, which is essentially what a relic is in the DC world. So Batman just basically picks up a magical weapon crafted by a different scientist and uses it, while T'Challa actually had to study and go through the Panther trials and get blessed by the Panther totem. So the fact that he uses magic is not really a way of saying that he has an advantage, because we never see Batman studying nanoscience, which is what all the super science in DC is based on, nanotechnology. And he builds complicated transporters by hand, teleportation devices, all of his jets and boats and whatever, again, because he doesn't trust anybody other than himself. So the idea that we have one guy who studied, trained constantly for his entire life, beat his uncle in combat at age 12, and was blessed by a Panther spirit, and we have another guy who was blessed by the writers with a nanoscience degree, is basically it's basically trying to give the advantage to Batman just because he's been written longer. I don't know. It feels like when we disregard aspect of one character, it says a lot about why we're disregarding that aspect of the character. And the idea that we would give credit to Batman for technology that we don't understand because it's at this point in its infancy or not even been harnessed, but getting blessed by the spiritual totem of your people is somehow cheating, is essentially, I think it feeds into that intrinsic covert bias again, because it's seen as more of a primitive thing, and therefore it can't be valuable, and therefore the culture can't be valuable and the hero can't be valuable. Whereas Batman did something we understand as education, and therefore by Western standards, and the hero is valuable.
So basically, you're kind of saying that this Western-centric perspective is kind of also helping feed into that narrative of Batman maybe being smarter than T'Challa.
It definitely doesn't. It definitely doesn't help. The idea that it's just it's hard. It's hard to say like a comic book character has done more work because he uses a fictitious science rather than the one who has done the same level of work, but he uses a fictitious magic.
Right.
So, yeah, I think that it feeds back into that loop of, what do we trust? Do we trust this? Do we trust this thing that we see in the context of science versus this thing we see in the context of, for lack of a better term, like Darkest Africa, the hidden tribe. It's got a lot of hearkening back to Rudyard Kipling and H. Rider Haggard sort of adventure stories where these exotic lands hold these secrets, and because they're secrets intrinsic to the exotic land, they're not valuable because you don't have to work at them. It kind of reminds me of the what was that? The Hoosiers movie about that Indiana basketball team of white kids who were good at fundamentals, but kept getting beaten by the black kids who actually could play. Mm-hmm. And they tried to basically make it so that all the tricks, all the excellent shots, all the complicated athletic displays of dunking were worthless because they didn't stick to fundamentals. And it was just kind of part of this exoticization of essentially Black Americans and also African folks.
Mysterious unknown type of aspect, right?
Right. It's basically it's just a way of delegitimizing the hero, delegitimizing the black basketball teams in the Hoosiers movie, and even Rocky III, when he had to learn how to fight like Apollo Creed, they essentially were showing how easy it was to learn because Apollo Creed had been fighting like that all his life, and Rocky learned it in 6 months. So
you list a whole slew of Batman's duties. Why do you propose that Batman actually does so much?
Amphetamines. Again, this is why we can't really make this comparison, because we're at the mercy of the writers. Every single writer wants to say, oh, Batman speaks this language, which is intrinsic to the story. Batman has this talent that is intrinsic to the story. He has studied this subject, which will come up here. So every time that he's been brought up, he gets another chance to get a degree. Congratulations. You've now got a PhD in super hyperspace physics. And whereas T'Challa grew up in Wakanda, which again was able to keep up with the outside world to the point that when they discovered a metal that to the rest of the world seemed like magic, they had the scientific knowledge to mine it. And I don't actually know if I've ever heard how they mine it, but since vibranium is supposed to absorb vibration, I don't know how they actually get it out of the ground. But again, it's a comic book. You're not supposed to look too deep into it. But anyways, they had the technology to harness it. They had the technology to use it and make it their own, while also fending off colonial forces. So they had an education system on par with the rest of the developed world. They had technology on par with the rest of the developed world. It wasn't just a bunch of loinclothed the Thing actually in the first appearance of Black Panther calls them refugees from a Tarzan movie.
I was kind of focusing on Batman, just particularly kind of what his motivations are, why he does what he does, and why you think that he does all of those things that you've listed in the article.
So Batman is a self-appointed protector of Gotham City. He thinks that, and rightly or wrongly, he's the only one who can handle this. So when there's a new Robin to train, there's at least 3. Batgirl to train, Azrael for a time, and I'm pretty sure I'm missing some folks, but we'll stop there. Also, he's builds his own super technology, because in the Quora article, they talked about him building teleportation devices, and they showed him with, you could tell that he was working on something very hard, because he had the zappy stick out and it was making sparks. So clearly he's a scientist. And so he does science. He not only is he a crime fighter in the sense that he swoops in and goes punchy punchy, but he's also a detective. So he has to find clues to determine where the bad guys are, to recon how to get in there, how to exploit their weaknesses, what technology is best to bring in his utility belt, because you don't think that he brings the same amount of equipment for Joker as he brings for Killer Croc or whatever. So he has to do all this stuff, keep up with his 10 languages plus, practice martial arts, and train just constantly. So he's either just completely whacked out on meth, or he has Hermione Granger's time turner from Harry Potter, because there is no way that you have that many hours in the day. So again, if we're going to compare the characters, none of this is their intrinsic value. This is what the writers put in to make the character seem cool at the time. And again, while we don't see T'Challa as often, he has done all these things. The first appearance, he had sent a transport device. It was, again, a hover vehicle of some kind, to the Fantastic Four, the most advanced scientific family in the Marvel Universe in the 60s. And he impressed Reed freaking Richards, who in every iteration of the Marvel Universe is one of the smartest people on the planet, possibly the smartest person on the planet. So it's not like he's just sent them a motorcycle. They have all the different sciences that superheroes do in the DC universe in Wakanda, but they did it at the same time fending off colonization, while Batman traveled the globe and picked up stuff here and there, which, again, in the Quora article, was seen as part of why he was superior, which actually sort of what's the word I'm looking for? Glorifies colonization, because Batman goes into these communities and doesn't give anything back. Mm-hmm. He stays with them, he's respectful or whatever, and maybe he does some dishes and sweeps some floors, but he doesn't invest billions of dollars into sustainable farming. He doesn't, fix their water mains. He doesn't do any of the things that could actually benefit the culture from a sharing perspective. He just goes in there, learns what he can, says goodbye, and goes home.
Okay. So Matt, you expressed amazement towards the fact that the Wakandan combat style didn't become incestuous. So this is kind of a two-part question. First, can you tell our audience what you actually meant by that?
I suppose I'd have to. It's I'm sure somebody's said it before, but it's something I kind of thought on my own. Growing up, I actually learned Taekwondo, and as I got to college and started opening up to more experiences in general, I started learning that Taekwondo schools, for the most part, suffer from what a lot of martial arts do, because they only train against each other. So Bruce Lee was probably the first person to really think about this, that the martial arts had become so single-minded that they lost the idea of principles. So when he developed Jeet Kune Do, one of the famous quotes that he had was, if you want to defeat a martial artist of 20 years, box for a year and wrestle for a year, because those two martial arts are they're based on fundamental basics of combat. And the other martial arts, they have reasons for doing what they do, but those reasons get lost with respect for tradition. So instead of knowing why you make the complicated stance, you just do it. And then when it comes time to apply that, you don't know why, and you just find yourself standing there in a complicated stance getting punched. More pragmatic martial arts, like, for instance, Krav Maga in Israel, mixed martial arts in the UFC and Pride and whatever else is out there these days, Bellator, they have a more combat focus, and therefore they train with different styles, they learn from different styles, and they incorporate things rather than say, we do this because we've always done this. So if Wakanda, again, we have to speculate a little bit, because if there is a detailed history of Wakanda, I'm not aware of it. But the Panther tribe has fended off colonization for centuries, and T'Challa himself beat his uncle at age 12. So what we have in Wakanda is a highly developed, very mature style of fighting. So I would imagine that it ranks very highly in the world's military styles of martial arts. The Marine Corps martial arts program, again, Krav Maga, Sambo from Russia, any one of these, they'd probably rank very well against. But of course, I'd have to know more about it to say specifically. But the idea that Batman would go around to different parts of the world and master 127 martial arts, which really isn't as impressive as it sounds, because once you learn like one martial art, it's really easy to apply the concepts to the next one. So just an easy example, if I learn how to box and I get really good at it to the point of mastery, then I could learn kickboxing very quickly because I just have to learn to kick. Similarly, if I learn kickboxing, to learn karate is basically the same stuff. Same thing with judo, jujitsu, and wrestling. Those different styles have so many fundamental similarities that the details are really based on strategy. Judo and wrestling are more sport combat, while jujitsu, there are sport jujitsus, but you can find schools where they teach more practical applications, where you have one time I was part of the administering of a green belt test, and the final challenge for the guy who was getting his green belt was to be attacked by 4 people and fend them off. Granted, he wasn't expected to win, but when we had him pinned down and we're all punching him, not terribly hard, and we know what we can do. But
arguing that the Wakanda combat style is more of a mixed combat style.
I would imagine so.
What you mean by it's not incestuous?
It's pragmatic. It's pragmatic, not traditional. Okay. And so when T'Challa is faced with 4 opponents holding him down, I imagine that in his head, his instructors are yelling, "You have teeth," and he'd be biting the person that's holding him down, much like the gentleman did when I was administering that test.
So a lot of these mixed martial arts, they obviously get influence from other martial arts. How do you think the Wakandan combat style was able to incorporate, I guess, the idea of using all these resources instead of sticking to kind of one style and one form?
Well, That is a question for somebody who grew up reading the comics, but I would imagine,
In your opinion, do you
in
have
my opinion, anyone who approaches a martial art with an idea towards pragmatism can sort of think, does this really work? And then retool the strategy and just redevelop it from there, just sort of get an idea of what works and what doesn't from practical application. Also, to my understanding, Wakanda is not what is it? It's not uncontacted. They're aware of the outside world. One of the reasons that they're hiding, so they have access to the knowledge of the rest of the world. They can go send out emissaries. They can bring people in if they trust them, or if the people happen to, I don't know, get lost in the jungle or whatever, however the writers want to set it up. They can get outside influence, and so they can learn from other people and learn about what's out there, send out somebody, have them recon for a little while, come back with a stack of books.
So you're arguing that basically the Wakandan combat style is adaptive.
I'm arguing that the results speak for themselves. You know, Batman may have gone throughout the world and relearned the same principles over and over again from 127 different martial artists, but Wakanda has fended off colonization in the heart of Africa for centuries, and that math comes up with you don't fight with a Wakandan.
Wow, that's a good point. And speaking of fighting with a Wakandan, who do you think would actually win the fight, Batman or T'Challa?
Mixed martial arts match, nothing but gloves, groin cup, and mouth guard. You know, I honestly wrote the piece as a way of just saying what we have to take into account when we ask questions like who would win. If the two of them walked off the pages of the comics into our world right now, I would have to give it to Batman. But that's because he's had these chances to grow and expand his repertoire so much. However, you know, I want to give it to Black Panther just because he's just cooler. But I don't know. Honestly, I don't know. Though fending off hundreds of years of colonization, I would have to say they're both going to go home very, very sore.
In your article, you say that Batman is an expression of Rand's Übermensch. Could you explain for our viewers what Rand's Übermensch is, and then also why you believe that to be the case?
Okay, well, I guess to start out, I would explain that Ayn Rand was a far-right philosopher who developed objectivism. With addition to competitive economics, there were a lot of moral and philosophical questions that she answered. One of her chief positions that people know her for is essentially that charity is immoral, which basically goes against every single other philosophy ever. The concept of the Superman, the Übermensch in German, was developed first by Nietzsche as sort of an idea of where humanity was heading. The idea of the superior man being born out of the masses. In comic books, the argument can be made that every single hero is an iteration of some form of Übermensch, but specifically in the Ayn Rand terms, the Übermensch is a man who takes the law, morality into his own hands and decides that he is going to do what is good, and good is a fundamentally defined concept. The reason that it's called objectivism is that they say A is A, and therefore there's no question about it. It's very black and white philosophy. So Batman gets up there and he says, "You're bad, you're good, I'm going to protect you and punch you in the face." And he does that through his insane amount of wealth. In the superhero world, he is not a man of privilege because he wasn't born an alien from another planet with bulletproof skin and laser eyes. He wasn't bitten by a radioactive spider and given powers. So everything that he has earned, although the argument, of course, is that he was given the societal privilege of vast wealth. But since in the superhero concept, he was a normal man that decided to take on this burden, he's the concept of the Ayn Rand Übermensch. It's a lot more stark in the Frank Miller Batman series because Frank Miller himself is an objectivist, or at least very sympathetic to objectivism. If you watch 300 or Sin City, you get a lot of the idea there. Another one of the ideas is that the majority is weak and insipid and corrupt, and the Übermensch must always rise above and manage them because it is their right and their duty. Batman specifically, doesn't have a responsibility to protect society by making sure that everyone has a level playing field. Everyone has to compete for what they can get. And if anybody cheats the game, essentially, Batman is allowed to swoop in and punch them in the face. Rand was famous for saying that her ideal Übermensch was a man who had murdered a 12-year-old girl because he did not believe that humans got in the way of his achieving his own desire. So take from that what you will.
All right. So I know that this is out of the realm of kind of comparing Batman and the Black Panther. But just out of curiosity, Matt, one thing that you didn't touch upon in your article is the significance of the warriors of in the Wakanda called the Dora Milaje, and they all happen to be women. So was Black Panther not only kind of the hero Black children needed so desperately, but also meant to kind of boost female empowerment, which was actually really important and starting to take effect and take hold during the 1960s?
Again, the reason that I didn't touch on that was because I don't have the backstory of Black Panther firmly cemented in my mind. Because even though I didn't read either of them growing up, I saw the Michael Keaton Batman in 1989 when it came out in theaters. So I've had exposure to Batmen all my life. And Black Panther was, like I said, always in the shadows, mentioned by the Avengers saying, oh, we could get some vibranium from T'Challa. We need to contact Black Panther and see if he's seen the echoes of this calamity that's happening here in New York. So I didn't really know a lot about the Dora Milaje. I don't even know how to pronounce it until I actually did this research and actually found out about that. And I don't think that I'm the right person to answer this because I don't know what was in Lee and Kirby's head when they wrote that. Far as I know, and I wasn't able to get a copy of the original appearance of Black Panther. My God, if I did. But I don't think that they showed up until Black Panther got his own series and they were able to delve deeper into Wakanda. Until then, it was just basically, Black Panther stepped out of Wakanda and now he's in a scrape. So let's get the Fantastic Four in there to go rescue him. I also wonder about the implications of a group of women being bred specifically to guard a male potentate. So while the intent might have been to show a liberating characters to women, they were still subject to Black Panther's needs and orders. So Black Panther's first appearances were not without their own problems, given that it was, two white Jewish men in New York writing about a hidden African nation. And
honestly, this reminds me of lions, right? Where the lionesses go and hunt, and you have basically one male head or one male figure. which is kind of feeding into that kind of Africa wildlife type of unknown habitat, which, yeah, I can see that as being particularly problematic, to be perfectly honest.
Specifically in the older periods of comic book and pop culture history, any representation came with its issues. God, I did a little bit of Googling on comic book racism, and it's simultaneously hilarious and just depressing. There was a scene in Green Lantern where Hal Jordan had an Eskimo friend, and he says to him, the guy's name is like Thomas, and he says to him, "I've never met an Eskimo before, except Eskimo Pie. Maybe I should call you Pie Face." "No, you should call him Thomas, because that's his name." So
an Eskimo was actually a derogatory term made up from another tribe. Is that they're actually called Inuits. So that kind of adds that layer of just kind of this ignorance and race.
Right, and if you look at racism. Yeah, if you look at the Super Friends cartoon, which I was exposed to as a young kid, they had I assume Mexican. He was Hispanic, but they had a character named El Dorado, who was from general Latin American country. They had a Japanese character, the Samurai, who was not a samurai, and he had whirlwind powers. So anytime that they opened up representation in the old days, it came with its own problems. So to say that the first iteration of the Dora Milaje were liberating representation, again, I'm not the person to answer that, but these are the questions that I would have when I would go to do the research, is whether or not they're just there as kind of Black Panther's supporting staff, or if they have any agency of their own, etc. So, moving forward, and I'm sure the movie represents it a lot better than any of the comic books do, but that's just not a question I could really answer, and that's why I didn't bring it up in the article.
Yeah, that's completely fair. So, Matt, just out of curiosity, who was your favorite actor to play Batman?
Well, like I said, I saw Michael Keaton when I was 6, so that kind of laid the groundwork for me. Though I also did see some Adam West, but there's only so long you can be enamored with big screens that go kapow. I would, I heard Benjamin Dixon talking about this, so he's my leftist nerd go-to apparently, but he was talking about who's the best Batman, and he actually gave it to Ben Affleck, and I think he made a solid case. Yeah. I think he made a really solid case. I would basically say, I can go ahead and tell you that George Clooney gets straight in the bin. Other than that, I would have to say it climbs back up to a combination of Christian Bale, Michael Keaton, and Ben Affleck. I'd probably say Ben Affleck's at the top, actually. And that hurts me to say it because Daredevil was painful.
So what comic hero do you think should be made into a movie or show next, whether they already exist or kind of a new universe needs to be created?
I would start by saying I prefer seeing comic book TV shows rather than movies. I'm really cheesed at Marvel lately because of their deal with Northrop Grumman, but really anyone that's going to have military technology has to be in bed with some contractor if they're going to be they're going to have military tech in their movies.
Right. Could you kind of explain that a little bit for our viewers?
Well, anytime that a movie studio wants to show planes or tanks or whatever, they have to have a deal with some kind of defense contractor. Transformers was really bad about this. They had, Michael Bay is just totally into explosions. And he, of course, had to show soldiers taking off in helicopters and firing guns at the Transformer Decepticons and whatever. So they have to have a deal with somebody to get those things onto the set. Just seeing Marvel that I had grown up reading being paired with Northrop Grumman, which is a defense contractor that, just essentially just sells weapons across the world to destroy local communities, just made me really, really sad. And I haven't gotten over it yet. But, the Netflix Marvel series has impressed me from what I've seen so far. Jessica Jones was really good. I am excited to see Adam Warlock show up in the Infinity Saga that's going on in the movies now. And that's a whole nother can of worms that we could be here forever talking about. But from people that haven't shown up yet, I wouldn't mind them doing Ghost Rider again if they could just keep Nick Cage away from the entire project. But that was painful. I loved Ghost Rider, and it was just awful. But we got a lot of Cage rage out of it, so.
That is true. Again, we're speaking with Matt Cox, author of Black Panther versus Batman, Social Influence on Comic Book Heroes. Thanks, Matt, for kind of talking with us and discussing your article. And I do advise everybody to go check it out. We will have a link available for you. So thank you again, Matt, for being here.
Thank you very much for having me. And I hope to see more coming out of Actify Press in the podcast.
Well, we hope to see more of your writing as well.
Well, you will, whether you want to or not.
Awesome. Well, it's a great piece. And again, thank you for discussing it with us.
Thank you.